At 73 years old, my husband served me dinner with a smile. "Eat it all, darling." But I saw him putting something in the food. I switched the plates. He fainted. I called the ambulance. "Doctor?" He fell and hit his head. The truth is, I found out he had killed before, and I was supposed to be next. Listen to my story until the end and comment which city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Margaret Whitmore, and I am 73 years old. Everything started on that fateful Tuesday evening in October when the autumn leaves were falling, like scattered memories outside our kitchen window. Harold had been acting strangely for weeks. My husband of 47 years, the man who once wrote me love letters every day during our courtship, had become distant and secretive. He would whisper into his phone late at night, thinking I was asleep. He would lock himself in his study for hours, claiming he was organizing his stamp collection, but I never heard the familiar sound of his magnifying glass clicking against the desk or the rustle of album pages. That evening, Harold prepared dinner with an enthusiasm I hadn't seen in months. He hummed an old tune we used to dance to in our younger days, his weathered hands moving with surprising grace as he chopped vegetables and stirred the pasta sauce. The aroma of garlic and basil filled our small kitchen, masking something else I couldn't quite identify. "Sit down, my dear Margaret," he said, his smile wider than usual, almost theatrical. "Tonight is special. I've prepared your favorite meal." I settled into my chair at our worn wooden table, the same one we'd bought at an estate sale 30 years ago. Harold served the pasta with a flourish, his eyes twinkling with what I initially mistook for renewed affection. But as he turned toward the stove to fetch the wine, I caught a glimpse of something in his hand, a small vial, nearly empty, being hastily tucked into his trouser pocket. My blood ran cold. In that instant, 47 years of marriage crystallized into a moment of terrible clarity. The late-night phone calls, the mysterious study sessions, the sudden interest in our life insurance policies he'd been reviewing just last week. Harold wasn't planning a romantic evening. He was planning my death. When he returned with the wine, I watched his face carefully. The smile remained, but his eyes held a coldness I'd never seen before. "Eat up, querida," he said, using the Spanish endearment he'd picked up during our honeymoon in Mexico decades ago. "You need to eat everything. It's good for you." My hands trembled as I lifted the fork, but I forced myself to remain calm. Harold sat across from me, barely touching his own plate, watching intently as I brought the first bite to my lips. In that moment, I made a decision that would change everything. "Oh, Harold," I said, feigning a coughing fit, "could you fetch me a glass of water? This wine is a bit strong." As soon as he turned his back, I switched our plates with the speed of a woman who had spent decades serving meals to ungrateful grandchildren during holiday gatherings. When Harold returned, he didn't notice the switch. Why would he? After nearly 5 decades together, we'd become invisible to each other in the way only long-married couples can be. We ate in relative silence, Harold growing increasingly impatient as I picked at what he believed was the poisoned meal. I watched him consume bite after bite of the pasta I was supposed to eat, my heart pounding with a mixture of terror and grim satisfaction. Halfway through the meal, Harold began to look pale. His fork clattered against the plate, and he pressed his hand to his forehead. "I feel strange," he muttered, his words beginning to slur. Within minutes, he collapsed face first into his remaining pasta. I called emergency services immediately, my voice steady despite the chaos in my mind. "My husband has fallen and hit his head on the table," I told the dispatcher. "Please send an ambulance immediately." The paramedics arrived within 8 minutes, their professional efficiency a stark contrast to the drama unfolding in our quiet dining room. As they worked on Harold, checking his vitals and preparing him for transport, I maintained the facade of the concerned wife. "Doctor," I said to the lead paramedic, a young man with kind eyes who reminded me of my nephew. He just suddenly collapsed and hit his head on the table edge. I think he might have had some kind of episode. At the hospital, I sat in the sterile waiting room, my hands folded in my lap like a proper widow in waiting. Dr. Sarah Chen, the attending physician, approached me with the gravity that comes with delivering difficult news. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said gently, "your husband is in critical condition. We've detected traces of what appears to be a significant amount of digitalis in his system. That's a compound found in foxglove plants. It can cause severe cardiac arrhythmia." I widened my eyes in apparent shock. Digitalis? How is that possible? Harold is a careful man. He wouldn't have ingested anything dangerous intentionally. Dr. Chen's expression grew more serious. "Mrs. Whitmore, I need to ask you some difficult questions. Has your husband been depressed lately? Has he mentioned anything about not wanting to live?" "Oh my goodness, no," I replied, allowing my voice to crack with emotion. "Harold loves life. He's been planning a trip to see our grandchildren next month. This must be some terrible accident." But even as I spoke those words, I knew the truth was far more complicated. You see, what I hadn't told Dr. Chen, what I hadn't told anyone, was that I had recognized the smell in that pasta sauce. It wasn't just garlic and basil. It was the distinctive bitter scent of foxglove, the same plant that grew wild in our backyard garden. Harold wasn't trying to poison me with some exotic substance. He was trying to use something readily available, something that would appear to be an accidental ingestion. Foxglove poisoning wasn't uncommon among elderly gardeners who confused the leaves with other herbs. It would have been the perfect crime if I hadn't been suspicious enough to switch those plates. Over the next 3 days, as Harold fought for his life in the intensive care unit, I began to uncover the truth about my husband's recent behavior. While cleaning his study, ostensibly to find important documents for the hospital, I discovered a hidden compartment in his old desk drawer. Inside, I found a stack of letters. Not love letters, but correspondence with a woman named Victoria Ashford, a widow he'd met at his Wednesday bridge club at the community centre. The letters were filled with passionate declarations of love and detailed plans for a future together. But more disturbing were the financial documents tucked beneath the letters. Harold had been systematically transferring money from our joint accounts into a separate account under his name alone. Thousands of dollars accumulated over months of careful manipulation. The final letter from Victoria, dated just 2 weeks prior, contained a chilling ultimatum. "My darling Harold, I cannot wait much longer. You promised me we would be together by Christmas. If Margaret is truly as ill as you claim, surely nature will take its course soon. But if not, perhaps we need to help fate along. I've done some research on natural remedies that might ease her suffering. Forever yours, Victoria." My hands shook as I read those words. Harold had been telling this woman that I was dying, that I was suffering from some terminal illness that would soon free him to begin his new life. When nature didn't cooperate with his timeline, he had decided to accelerate the process. But there was more. Hidden beneath the love letters were copies of life insurance policies, all recently updated with Harold as the sole beneficiary. He had forged my signature on the documents, something that would have been easy for a man who had been handling our finances for decades. The most chilling discovery was a notebook filled with Harold's handwriting, detailing his research into untraceable poisons and methods of murder that would appear accidental. Pages and pages of notes about digitalis, oleander, ricin, and other natural toxins. He had been planning this for months, maybe longer. I sat in his study, surrounded by the evidence of my husband's betrayal, and felt something inside me die. Not the quick death he had planned for me, but the slow, grinding death of trust, of love, of the life I thought I had been living. On the 4th day, Dr. Chen called me with an update. Harold had stabilized but remained unconscious. The digitalis had caused significant damage to his heart, and even if he recovered, he would likely face serious long-term health consequences. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, "I need to discuss something sensitive with you. The amount of digitalis in your husband's system suggests a massive dose, far more than would occur from accidental ingestion. We're required to report this to the authorities as a possible poisoning case." I felt my carefully constructed facade beginning to crack. Are you suggesting that Harold tried to hurt himself? Because I can tell you that's impossible. He's not that kind of man. Actually, Dr. Chen said carefully, we found something else. When we pumped his stomach, we discovered that he had consumed 2 different meals shortly before the poisoning. The digitalis was only in one of them. It's almost as if someone switched plates. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. I could feel Dr. Chen's eyes studying my face, looking for tells, for cracks in my story. I don't understand what you're suggesting, I said finally. Mrs. Whitmore, is there anything else you think we should know about what happened that evening? I took a deep breath, weighing my options. I could continue the charade, maintain Harold's innocence and my ignorance, or I could tell the truth and face the consequences. Doctor, I said slowly, I think you should speak to Detective Morrison. He'll want to hear what I have to say. Detective James Morrison arrived at the hospital within an hour. He was a man in his 50s, with graying temples and the weary eyes of someone who had seen too much human cruelty. We sat in a small conference room, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across his face as I began to tell my story. Detective Morrison, I began, my husband tried to poison me that evening. I switched the plates because I saw him put something in my food. Morrison leaned forward, his expression carefully neutral. Mrs. Whitmore, those are serious accusations. Can you walk me through exactly what happened? I told him everything, about Harold's strange behavior, about the vial I'd seen him hide, about my split-second decision to switch the plates. Morrison listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in a small notebook. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Mrs. Whitmore, if what you're telling me is true, your husband attempted to murder you, and your actions were in self-defense. However, you also allowed him to consume what you knew was a poisoned meal, and you lied to the paramedics and medical staff about how he became ill. What was I supposed to do? I asked, my voice rising despite my efforts to remain calm. Let him kill me. Harold had been planning this for months. He had another woman, Detective Morrison. He had stolen money from our accounts and taken out life insurance policies on me. I was defending myself. Morrison nodded slowly. We'll need to investigate these claims, Mrs. Whitmore. In the meantime, I need you to understand that you could face charges related to your husband's poisoning, even if we determine that you were acting in self-defense. Over the next several weeks, as Harold remained in a medically induced coma, the investigation unfolded like a complex puzzle. Detective Morrison and his team searched our house, discovering Harold's hidden correspondence with Victoria Ashford, the forged insurance documents, and the notebook filled with research on poisons. They also found the source of the digitalis. Harold had been harvesting and drying foxglove leaves from our garden, grinding them into a powder that he had been incorporating into various foods over several weeks. The investigation revealed that I had been consuming small amounts of the poison for nearly a month, doses too small to cause immediate symptoms, but large enough to gradually weaken my system and make the final, fatal dose appear more natural. Victoria Ashford was arrested at her home, where investigators found more love letters and detailed plans for her future with Harold. She had been complicit in the murder plot, providing encouragement and even research into methods of poisoning. Under questioning, she revealed that Harold had promised to be free by Christmas, telling her that I was suffering from a terminal illness that would soon claim my life. Harold said Margaret was dying anyway, Victoria told investigators, her voice steady and without remorse. He was just helping her along so we could be together. It wasn't really murder if she was going to die anyway. The callousness of her statement chilled everyone involved in the case. Here was a woman who had been prepared to help orchestrate my death simply to be with my husband. As the investigation continued, more disturbing details emerged. Harold had been slowly poisoning me for weeks, using the foxglove powder in small doses added to my morning coffee. The symptoms I had attributed to aging, fatigue, occasional dizziness, mild nausea, were actually signs of chronic digitalis poisoning. Dr. Chen confirmed this when she reviewed my medical records from recent months. Mrs. Whitmore, she explained during one of our meetings. Your husband wasn't planning to kill you quickly that evening. He had been weakening you systematically, making you sick enough that a larger dose would have appeared to be the final stage of a natural illness. The realization that Harold had been slowly murdering me for months left me feeling violated in ways I couldn't articulate. This man who had shared my bed, who had held my hand during movies, who had kissed me goodnight every evening, had been systematically poisoning me day by day. The legal proceedings were complex and emotionally draining. The district attorney, a stern woman named Patricia Hawkins, initially considered charging me with attempted murder for switching the plates. However, as more evidence emerged about Harold's premeditated plan to kill me, the charges were reduced to reckless endangerment and providing false information to emergency responders. Mrs. Whitmore, D.A. Hawkins explained during one of our meetings, while we understand that you were acting in self-defense, you also made a conscious decision to allow your husband to consume what you knew was poisoned food. Additionally, you lied to paramedics and medical staff, which could have compromised his medical care. My attorney, a sharp young woman named Rebecca Torres, argued that I had been acting under extreme duress and that my actions were justified given the immediate threat to my life. Your Honor, she said during my plea hearing, Mrs. Whitmore was faced with an impossible choice. Her husband was attempting to murder her, and she had seconds to react. Her decision to switch the plates may have saved her own life, and her subsequent actions were those of a woman in shock and fear. The judge, an elderly man named Honorable Thomas Bradley, listened carefully to all arguments before rendering his decision. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, looking at me over his glasses, this court recognizes that you were the victim of a systematic attempt on your life by your husband. However, your actions in allowing him to consume the poisoned food, while understandable, were still illegal. This court sentences you to 2 years of supervised probation and 200 hours of community service. I accepted the sentence with relief. I had expected much worse. Harold never regained full consciousness. The digitalis poisoning had caused irreparable damage to his heart and brain. He remained in a persistent vegetative state for 6 months before I made the difficult decision to remove life support. The doctors assured me that he was not suffering, that he was not aware of his surroundings, but I will never know if that was truly the case. I sat beside his bed in those final hours, holding the hand that had once caressed my face and later prepared my poison. I found myself thinking about the man I had married 47 years earlier, the young postal worker who had courted me with flowers and poetry. Where had that man gone? When had he become someone capable of cold-blooded murder? Harold, I whispered, as his breathing became more labored, I forgive you. I don't understand what happened to us, but I forgive you. He died that evening as the autumn sun was setting, the same season when he had tried to kill me. Victoria Ashford was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to 15 years in prison. During her trial, she showed no remorse for her actions, maintaining that she and Harold had been truly in love and that I was merely an obstacle to their happiness. Margaret Whitmore was standing in the way of true love, she said during her sentencing hearing. Harold and I were meant to be together. If she had just died naturally like she was supposed to, none of this would have happened. Her words revealed a woman completely detached from the reality of what they had planned. In her mind, my murder would have been justified by their love story. The community centre, where Harold had met Victoria, disbanded their Wednesday bridge club following the scandal. The other members, mostly elderly widows and widowers looking for companionship, were horrified to learn that their social gathering had been the breeding ground for a murder plot. Mrs. Eleanor Ketchum, who had been the club's organizer for over a decade, came to visit me several months after Harold's death. Margaret, she said, sitting in my living room with a cup of tea, I keep replaying those Wednesday afternoons in my mind. Harold seemed like such a gentleman. He was always polite, always helpful. I introduced him to Victoria because they both seemed lonely. I never imagined... Eleanor, I interrupted gently, you couldn't have known. None of us could have known what Harold was capable of. But even as I spoke those words, I wondered if there had been signs I had missed, red flags that I had ignored because they came from someone I trusted completely. My relationship with our children became strained following Harold's death and the revelation of his crimes. Our son Michael, a successful lawyer in his 40s, struggled to reconcile the father he remembered with the man who had tried to murder his mother. "Mom," he said during one of our awkward phone conversations, "I keep thinking about all the times Dad made dinner for the family. Were you ever suspicious? Did you ever think he might?" "Michael," I said, "your father wasn't always the man he became in those final months. For 46 years, he was a good husband and father. Something changed in him, something I didn't recognize until it was almost too late. Our daughter Sarah took the news even harder. She refused to speak to me for several months, somehow blaming me for Harold's death, despite the evidence of his crimes. "You let him die, Mum," she said during our last conversation, before her silence began. "You could have called for help immediately, but you let him eat that food, knowing it was poisoned." Her accusation cut deeper than any legal charges could have. Sarah was right, in a way. I had made a conscious choice to let Harold consume the meal he had prepared for me. I had chosen my life over his, and while legally justifiable, the moral weight of that decision would stay with me forever. The house that Harold and I had shared for over 2 decades became a prison of memories. Every room held reminders of our life together, now tainted by the knowledge of his betrayal. The kitchen where he had prepared my final meal felt especially cursed. I found myself unable to cook there, ordering takeout or eating simple cold meals that required no preparation. The garden where Harold had grown the foxglove that nearly killed me became a source of particular anguish. I hired a landscaping company to remove every trace of the deadly plants, but I could never forget that they had grown there, nurtured by the same hands that had once tenderly cared for my roses. Dr. Patricia Williams, the therapist recommended by the court as part of my probation, helped me work through the complex trauma of discovering that my husband, of nearly 5 decades, had been systematically poisoning me. "Margaret," she said during one of our sessions, "you're experiencing a form of grief that's particularly complex because it involves both loss and betrayal simultaneously. You're mourning the death of your husband, while also processing the fact that he tried to murder you." "I keep having nightmares," I told her. "In my dreams, I'm eating dinner with Harold, and I can taste the poison in every bite. But in the dreams, I can't switch the plates. I just keep eating, knowing that each bite is killing me." Dr. Williams nodded knowingly. "Those dreams represent your feelings of powerlessness during those weeks when you were being slowly poisoned without knowing it. Your subconscious is processing the violation of trust you experienced." The community service portion of my sentence involved working at a local domestic violence shelter, an irony that wasn't lost on me. Here I was, a woman who had killed her husband in self-defense, counseling other women who were trying to escape abusive relationships. The work was both healing and heartbreaking. I met women whose husbands had beaten them, threatened them, controlled their finances, and isolated them from friends and family. Their stories reminded me that domestic violence takes many forms, and that Harold's slow poisoning was just another method of control and abuse. Maria Santos, a young mother of 2 who had fled her abusive husband, became particularly close to me during my time at the shelter. "Mrs. Margaret," she said one afternoon as we sorted donated clothing, "how did you know? How did you know your husband was trying to hurt you?" "I almost didn't," I replied honestly. "I had gotten so used to trusting him completely that I nearly ignored the warning signs. It was only in that final moment when I saw him hide that vial that I realized what was happening." Maria nodded thoughtfully. "My husband used to put things in my food, too. Not poison, but sleeping pills. He would drug me when he wanted to go out with other women, so I wouldn't wake up and catch him leaving." Her story reminded me that my experience, while extreme, wasn't unique. Countless women were being victimized by men they loved and trusted, men who used that trust as a weapon against them. The most difficult part of my recovery was learning to trust my own judgment again. Harold's betrayal had shaken my confidence in my ability to read people, to recognize danger, to protect myself. If I could live with someone for 47 years and not realize he was capable of murder, how could I trust anyone ever again? This mistrust extended to everyday interactions. When my neighbor brought me homemade cookies, I found myself wondering if they were safe to eat. When the mailman was unusually friendly, I questioned his motives. When my doctor prescribed new medication, I researched every ingredient to ensure it wasn't harmful. Dr. Williams assured me that this hypervigilance was a normal response to trauma, but that didn't make it easier to live with. "Margaret," she explained, "your brain is trying to protect you from another betrayal by becoming suspicious of everyone. Over time, as you heal, you'll learn to distinguish between reasonable caution and excessive fear." 1 year after Harold's death, I made the decision to sell our house and move to a small apartment across town. I couldn't continue living in the place where he had planned my murder, where every corner held memories, now poisoned by knowledge of his true intentions. The day I signed the final papers, I felt a mixture of sadness and relief. I was closing the door on nearly 5 decades of shared history, but I was also freeing myself from the weight of those tainted memories. My new apartment was small but sunny, with a tiny balcony where I could grow herbs, safe ones like basil and oregano that would never be confused with anything deadly. It represented a new beginning, a chance to rebuild my life on my own terms. The legal aftermath of Harold's crimes continued for over 2 years. The insurance companies challenged the policies he had taken out on me, arguing that they were fraudulent. Eventually, they were voided, but not before lengthy court proceedings that kept the wounds fresh and prevented me from truly moving forward. Victoria Ashford's family also filed a civil suit against Harold's estate, claiming that he had lured their daughter into the murder plot and that she was as much a victim as I was. The suit was eventually dismissed, but it added another layer of complexity to an already difficult situation. During this time, I received dozens of letters from strangers who had read about my case in the newspapers. Some were supportive, praising me for my quick thinking and survival instincts. Others were critical, arguing that I should have found another way to protect myself that didn't result in Harold's death. One letter from a woman named Catherine Miller, whose husband had also tried to poison her, was particularly meaningful. "Dear Mrs. Whitmore," she wrote, "I read about your case in the newspaper, and I wanted you to know that you're not alone. My husband tried to poison me with antifreeze mixed into my morning orange juice. Unlike you, I didn't realize what was happening until I was in the hospital dying. The doctors saved my life, but barely. I wanted to tell you that you did nothing wrong. You saved your own life, and that's something to be proud of, not ashamed of." Her letter reminded me that survival sometimes requires difficult choices, and that my decision to switch those plates was an act of self-preservation, not murder. 2 years after Harold's death, I received an unexpected visitor. Detective Morrison, now retired from the police force, came to my apartment to check on my progress and to share some information that had emerged during his continued investigation of similar cases. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, sitting in my small living room, "I wanted you to know that your case helped us solve 2 other suspicious deaths in the county. We found evidence that your husband may not have been planning his first murder." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. "What do you mean?" "We reopened the case of Harold's first wife, Dorothy, who died 15 years before you met him. Her death was originally ruled natural causes, heart failure. But given what we learned about Harold's methods and his knowledge of plant-based toxins, we had her body exhumed and tested. I felt sick as I realized where this was leading. We found traces of digitalis in her hair and bone samples," Morrison continued. "Harold killed his first wife using the same method he tried to use on you. You weren't his first intended victim, Margaret. You were his second successful victim, except you survived. The knowledge that Harold had murdered before, that I had been married to a serial killer for 47 years, was almost too much to bear. Dorothy's death had occurred just 2 years before Harold and I met. Had he been looking for his next victim when he began courting me? "Detective Morrison," I asked, my voice barely a whisper, "do you think he married me planning to kill me eventually?" Morrison's expression was grave. "I don't know, Mrs. Whitmore. It's possible that the idea developed over time, especially when he met Victoria and wanted to start a new life. Or it's possible that he had always planned to kill his wives when they became inconvenient. We may never know his true motivations." The revelation about Dorothy's murder cast my entire marriage in a new light. Had Harold been planning my death for decades? Had every loving gesture been part of a long-term deception? The questions were maddening because they could never be answered. I began attending a support group for survivors of domestic violence, where I met other women whose stories shared common threads with mine. The group was led by Dr. Amanda Foster, a psychologist who specialized in intimate partner violence. "The thing people don't understand about cases like yours, Margaret," Dr. Foster explained during one session, "is that the abuse isn't always physical or even obvious. Your husband spent months, maybe years, psychologically conditioning you to trust him completely so that when he decided to kill you, you would never suspect him." The other women in the group nodded in understanding. Many of them had experienced similar psychological manipulation, though not always with such deadly intent. Jenny Martinez, whose husband had controlled every aspect of her life for 20 years, became a close friend. "My husband never tried to poison me," she said, "but he poisoned my relationships with my family, my friends, my children. He isolated me so completely that when I finally realized what was happening, I had no one to turn to." These conversations helped me understand that Harold's crimes existed on a spectrum of abusive behavior, and that my experience, while extreme, was part of a larger pattern of men who use intimate relationships as vehicles for control and violence. 3 years after Harold's death, I made another difficult decision. I agreed to participate in a documentary about domestic violence and intimate partner murder. The filmmaker, a young woman named Lisa Chen, wanted to explore cases where women had fought back against their abusers. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said during our first interview, "your story is important because it shows that domestic violence doesn't always look the way people expect. Your husband wasn't hitting you or screaming at you. He was slowly poisoning you while maintaining the facade of a loving marriage." The documentary, titled Hidden in Plain Sight, premiered at several film festivals and eventually aired on a national television network. The response was overwhelming, with hundreds of viewers reaching out to share their own stories of subtle abuse and manipulation. One viewer's email particularly moved me. A woman named Rebecca Thompson wrote, "Mrs. Whitmore, watching your story made me realize that my husband's behavior isn't normal. He's been putting sleeping pills in my tea every night for months, telling me it's an herbal remedy for insomnia. After watching your documentary, I had the tea tested. You saved my life by sharing your story." Messages like Rebecca's helped me understand that sharing my experience, painful as it was, might help other women recognize the warning signs of intimate partner violence before it was too late. The 4th anniversary of that terrible evening arrived with little fanfare. I marked the date privately, spending the morning at Harold's grave, where I had placed a simple headstone with just his name and dates. I didn't include the traditional "beloved husband and father" inscription that adorned most of the graves around his. I couldn't bring myself to lie, even in stone. "Harold," I said aloud to his grave, "I still don't understand why you did what you did, but I've learned to live with not understanding. I've learned that some questions don't have answers that would satisfy me anyway." That evening, I prepared dinner in my small apartment kitchen, a simple meal of grilled chicken and vegetables. As I sat at my table, I reflected on how much my life had changed since that night when I switched our plates. I was no longer the trusting, naive woman who had shared a bed with a man planning her murder. I was stronger, more cautious, but also more compassionate toward other women facing similar situations. The nightmares had mostly stopped, replaced by dreams of the future I was building for myself. I had developed friendships with women from the support group, relationships built on mutual understanding and shared experience rather than proximity and habit. My relationship with my children had slowly improved, though it would never be the same. Michael had come to understand that my actions had been necessary for my survival, and he visited regularly. Sarah still struggled with anger and confusion, but she had begun returning my phone calls and had even visited on my birthday. "Mom," she said during her last visit, "I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't switched those plates. If Dad had succeeded in killing you, Victoria would have comforted him at your funeral, and they would have lived happily ever after on your life insurance money. You saved yourself, and you also prevented him from profiting from your murder." Her words helped me see my actions from a different perspective. I hadn't just saved my own life. I had prevented Harold and Victoria from succeeding in their plan to kill me and live off the proceeds. As I write this now, 5 years have passed since that October evening. I am 78 years old, and I have learned to live with the complex legacy of my marriage and my husband's crimes. I have learned that love and evil can coexist in the same person, that trust can be weaponized, and that survival sometimes requires making choices that will haunt you forever. I still cook for myself every evening, though I no longer take pleasure in elaborate meals. I still tend a small garden on my apartment balcony. Though I grow only plants I am certain are safe, I still sleep alone in a single bed, though I no longer fear that someone will poison my morning coffee. The truth about that evening when my husband served me dinner with a smile is more complex than the simple story of a woman defending herself from a murderous spouse. It's a story about the gradual erosion of trust, about the way evil can hide behind love, about the split-second decisions that determine who lives and who dies. People sometimes ask me if I regret switching those plates, if I wish I had found another way to protect myself that didn't result in Harold's death. The answer is complicated. I regret that my marriage was built on deception. I regret that I lived for months consuming small doses of poison without knowing it. I regret that Harold chose murder over divorce, betrayal over honesty, but I don't regret saving my own life. I don't regret refusing to be his victim. I don't regret that Dorothy's killer finally faced justice, even if it came too late to save her. The evening Harold served me dinner with that terrible smile, telling me to eat everything on my plate, he thought he was serving me my death. Instead, he served himself his own. And while I carry the weight of that outcome every day, I also carry the knowledge that I survived, that I fought back, and that I refused to become another statistic in the long history of women killed by men who claimed to love them. That is the truth about that evening, the whole truth and nothing but the truth. It is a truth I can live with, even if I can never forget it.